In the year 1509, somewhere in southern India, a 37-year-old warrior became king of an empire most people today have never heard of. His name was Krishna-devaraya, and he was about to build something so magnificent that travelers from across the world would struggle to find words to describe it. What he created would become one of the largest and wealthiest cities on the planet. And what happened to that city just a few decades later would become one of history's most dramatic falls from grace. Let me take you back 500 years to a place called Vijayanagara, which means City of Victory. It sat along the banks of a river called Tungabhadra in what is now the state of Karnataka in India. When Krishna-devaraya took the throne, this empire had already been standing for about 170 years. It was the last great Hindu empire of southern India, a place that had managed to hold its own while the rest of the subcontinent faced wave after wave of invasions from the north. But Krishna-devaraya did not just want to maintain what he inherited. He wanted to make it legendary. And that is exactly what he did. Within 20 years of his rule, the capital city of Vijayanagara grew into something that rivaled Rome, Beijing, and Constantinople. We know this because we have written accounts from Portuguese traders who actually walked those streets. One of them, a horse trader named Domingo Paes, visited in 1520. He later wrote down everything he saw, and his words paint a picture that is almost impossible to imagine today. Paes described wandering through the city with his head turning so often from one side to the other that he almost fell off his horse. He wrote that it felt like he was seeing a vision, like surely he must be dreaming. The markets overflowed with silk, spices, and precious stones. Temples rose so high they looked like mountains carved from stone. The royal palace complex was so enormous that it had its own lakes inside it, its own gardens, and stables that could hold dozens of elephants. The population of this city swelled to nearly 500,000 people. Its defensive walls stretched for 24 miles. And here is what makes it even more interesting. This was not some isolated kingdom cut off from the rest of the world. Vijayanagara was deeply connected to global trade. Merchants came from Persia, from Arabia, from Portugal, from as far as China. The markets buzzed with different languages, different currencies, different goods from every corner of the known world. And Krishna-devaraya himself was not what you might expect from a medieval Hindu king. Yes, he built temples and patronized priests. But he also wore Persian-style court dress and employed Muslim cavalry commanders in his army. His capital had buildings that blended Hindu architecture with Islamic design elements. This was a cosmopolitan empire, a place where different cultures mixed and influenced each other in ways that might surprise you. But Krishna-devaraya was more than just a builder and a warrior. He was also a poet. He wrote works in both Telugu and Sanskrit, and his court became the most celebrated gathering of literary minds in all of southern India. He surrounded himself with 8 master poets, a group so respected that they were given a nickname that translates to the 8 elephants of literature. These men produced works that defined South Indian poetry for centuries to come. One of them was a man famous for his wit and humor. Another was honored by the king himself as the grandfather of Telugu poetry. Together, they created a golden age of literature that flourished under royal protection. And Krishna-devaraya contributed to it personally. His own epic poem told the story of a female saint's divine love for the god Vishnu. But here is the important part. He wrote it not in Sanskrit, the language of priests that common people could not understand, but in Telugu, the language of his people. It was a deliberate choice that elevated regional language and culture to the highest level of prestige. For 2 decades, everything seemed perfect. The empire expanded. The treasury overflowed. The arts flourished. Travelers returned home with stories that made Vijayanagara sound like something out of a fairy tale. But fairy tales do not last forever. In 1529, Krishna-devaraya died. He was only 58 years old, and with his death, the cracks began to show. The kings who followed him were weaker. Real power slowly shifted away from the throne and into the hands of an ambitious minister named Alia Rama Raya. This man had married into the royal family, and by the 1540s, he was effectively running the empire while puppet kings sat on the throne and did whatever he told them. Now Rama Raya was clever. To the north of Vijayanagara sat 5 Muslim sultanates, each one a potential threat. These sultanates often fought among themselves, and Rama Raya learned to play them against each other. He would ally with one sultan to attack another, then switch sides and do the same thing again. For 20 years, this strategy worked brilliantly. Vijayanagara stayed on top, extracting tribute and territory from neighbors who could never quite unite against it. But there was a problem. Rama Raya was arrogant. He insulted the sultans personally. He humiliated them in negotiations. He treated them as inferior, as pawns in his game. And slowly, quietly, resentment built up across the north. By 1564, the sultans had finally had enough. Setting aside decades of their own bitter rivalries, 4 of the 5 sultanates formed an alliance that had one single purpose. They were going to destroy Vijayanagara once and for all. In late December of that year, the combined armies began their march south. Rama Raya, now in his 70s, received the news without much concern. He had faced threats before. He had always won, and the numbers seemed to favor him. His army reportedly numbered around 140,000 soldiers. The coalition coming against him had perhaps 110,000. What Rama Raya did not fully appreciate was that the Sultanate armies had something his forces lacked. They had superior artillery, with cannons operated by expert Turkish gunners who knew how to use them with devastating effect. They had cavalry mounted on fast Persian horses, instead of the slower locally bred animals that Vijayanagara relied on. And most dangerously of all, they had something that Rama Raya never suspected. They had traitors inside his own ranks. On January 23, 1565, the 2 armies met on a dusty plain near villages called Rakasa and Tangadi, close to the Krishna River. History would remember this day as the Battle of Talikota. The fighting began at dawn. For hours, things seemed to go well for Vijayanagara. The right side of their army, commanded by Rama Raya's brother Tirumala, pushed back the forces of Bidar. The center held firm against everything thrown at it. Soldiers on both sides fell by the thousands, but victory still seemed possible. Then everything changed in an instant. 2 generals serving in the Vijayanagara army, brothers who commanded significant forces, suddenly turned their troops against their own side. The betrayal came without warning. Chaos erupted across the battlefield as soldiers who had been allies moments before began attacking each other. In the confusion, enemy troops from Ahmadnagar broke through the lines and reached Rama Raya himself. The elderly commander was pulled from his war elephant. And right there, on that battlefield, the Sultan of Ahmadnagar personally cut off his head. When that severed head was raised on a pike for everyone to see, the Vijayanagara army simply fell apart. Soldiers who had been fighting bravely moments before dropped their weapons and ran. It was not a retreat. It was a collapse. Tirumala, seeing that all was lost, grabbed the young puppet king and as much gold as could be carried and fled south toward a fortress called Penukanda. Behind him, the road to the greatest city in India lay completely undefended. The Sultanate armies did not bother chasing the survivors. They had a much bigger prize in sight. They turned their forces toward Vijayanagara itself. What happened next would shock the world, and it would take 5 long months to complete. The battle was over. The old commander was dead, and the greatest city in India had no one left to protect it. When the Sultanate armies turned away from the battlefield and marched toward Vijayanagara, they found something they probably did not expect. The city was essentially empty of defenders. The soldiers had fled. The generals had run south with whatever treasure they could grab. The royal family was gone. What remained was a city of merchants, craftsmen, priests, and ordinary people who had woken up that morning thinking life would go on as it always had. What followed over the next 5 to 6 months was one of the most complete destructions of a city in all of medieval history. And we know this not from legend or myth, but from actual accounts written by people who either witnessed it or arrived shortly after. The combined armies of 4 sultanates did not simply occupy Vijayanagara. They dismantled it. They went through the city with crowbars and axes, tearing down buildings that had taken generations to construct. They smashed the faces off of statues. They toppled pillars that had stood for 2 centuries. They set fire to the great markets where traders from across the world had once haggled over silk and spices. They burned the palaces where kings had held court and poets had recited verses. A British historian named Robert Sewell, who pieced together this story centuries later from old records, wrote that never perhaps in the history of the world had such destruction been brought upon such a splendid city so suddenly. One day it was the wealthiest, most prosperous place in India, teeming with nearly 500,000 people. The next, it was being systematically erased from existence. The ordinary people of the city faced a terrible fate. Many of the men did not survive. Women and skilled craftsmen were taken away. The priests who had maintained the great temples scattered. The poets who had once enjoyed royal protection fled to whatever corners of the land would have them. Everything that had made Vijayanagara magnificent was either destroyed, stolen, or driven away. And then, after months of this, the Sultanate armies simply left. They had gotten what they came for. The city that had humiliated them for decades was gone. There was nothing left worth taking. What happened next might be the strangest part of this whole story. Nobody came back. Think about that for a moment. This was one of the largest cities in the entire world. It had infrastructure that had taken 2 centuries to build. It had water systems, temples, roads, and walls that stretched for 24 miles. And after the sultanates left, nobody tried to rebuild it. Nobody tried to resettle it. The survivors who had fled simply stayed away. An Italian merchant named Cesare Federici visited the ruins a few decades later. What he described sounds like something from a post-apocalyptic story. He wrote that the city was not altogether destroyed, that the houses still stood, but they were empty. Nothing lived in them, he said, except tigers and other wild beasts. Try to picture that. A city that had once held 500,000 people, where merchants had shouted prices and elephants had paraded through streets, was now so abandoned that wild animals had moved in. The irrigation canals that had fed the gardens dried up. The temples that had once blazed with lamps and echoed with hymns fell silent. Vines crept over the carved stones. Dust settled on everything. The city of victory had become a ghost town. But what about the people who escaped? What happened to the empire itself? Tirumala, the brother of the commander who had been killed in battle, managed to reach the southern fortress of Penukonda with the young puppet king and whatever remained of the royal treasury. He tried to hold things together. He established what historians call the Aravidu dynasty and attempted to rebuild some kind of central authority. But the damage was too deep. The empire did not just lose a battle, or even a capital. It lost the very idea that held it together. You see, Vijayanagara had always been a collection of regions held together by the power of the center. Local governors called Nayakas had managed different territories, but they answered to the throne. They paid tribute. They sent soldiers when called. The whole system worked because everyone believed in the strength of the capital. Now that strength was gone, and one by one, the Nayakas decided they no longer needed to answer to anyone. The governors of Madurai in the far south declared independence. So did the rulers of Thanjavur and Jinji and Mysore and Kaladi. Within a generation, what had been a unified empire shattered into a patchwork of smaller kingdoms, each one looking out for itself, each one too weak to stand against the greater powers that would eventually come. The Aravidu dynasty limped along for another 80 years, but it was a shadow of what had existed before. The capital kept moving further and further south, from Panukonda to Chandragiri to Vellore. Each move was really a retreat, a sign that the dynasty controlled less and less with each passing decade. The sultans who had destroyed Vijayanagara did not last much longer themselves. Their alliance fell apart almost immediately after the victory. They went back to fighting each other. Eventually, the Mughal Empire from the north would swallow most of them up. The wheel of history kept turning. But here is where this story takes an unexpected turn, because something did survive. The Nayaka kingdoms that broke away from the dying empire became important cultural centers on their own. The rulers of Madurai expanded a great temple dedicated to the goddess Meenakshi into one of the most spectacular religious sites in India. The Nayakas of Thanjavur became patrons of classical music and dance, helping to develop the art form we now call Bharatanatyam. The architectural styles that had flourished in Vijayanagara spread across the south, carried by craftsmen who had fled the destruction. The poets who scattered from the ruined capital brought their traditions with them. The musical systems developed by composers who had once performed by the Tungabhadra River became the foundation of South Indian classical music. A man named Purandara Dasa, who had sung in Vijayanagara during its final decades, is still remembered today as the father of Carnatic music. His system of teaching remains in use 5 centuries later. So the empire fell, but the culture did not die. It transformed, it spread, it took root in a dozen different places and kept growing. And what about the ruins themselves? The city that was abandoned to tigers eventually found a new kind of life. Today, it is called Hampi, and it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists from around the world come to walk among the same granite boulders that Portuguese traders once marveled at. The stone chariot at one of the temples is so famous that it appears on the back of India's 50-rupee note. Archaeologists keep discovering new structures, new inscriptions, new pieces of a world that ended in a single afternoon of betrayal. The Virupaksha temple, dedicated to the god Shiva, never completely stopped functioning. Even through centuries of abandonment and chaos, priests maintained the rituals. Pilgrims still came, picking their way through ruins to reach a sacred site that refused to die entirely. There is a lesson buried somewhere in these stones. An empire that took 2 centuries to build fell in a single day. A city that rivaled Rome was emptied in 5 months, yet the songs survived. The poetry survived. The dance and the music and the way of carving stone all found new homes and new patrons. Krishnadevaraya's poets had called their literary gathering the conquest of the world. In the end, the world conquered them. But walking through Hampi today, watching the sun set over boulders that have witnessed 500 years of silence, you start to understand that conquest is not the final word. Some things refuse to disappear completely. Some things wait in the ruins for someone to remember them. And sometimes that is enough.